I'd just like to, I will do the Libraries Tasmania acknowledgement of Tasmania's Aboriginal peoples first. We acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future who hold the memories, traditions, culture and hope of the Tasmanian's First Peoples. Libraries Tasmania also pays respect to the resilience and strengths of Tasmanian Aboriginal people and extends that respect to all our first Australian peoples. I'd just like to introduce Stephanie McDonald. She's a Conservator in the Government Archives and Preservation section of Libraries Tasmania, and we'll talk about looking after your family photos. Steph, would you like people to ask questions or at the end?
Probably if we keep questions to the end, that would be the easiest thing, and I won't go off on a very long side tangent and then wonder where I was supposed to be.
And then also you're available if people then want to ask you questions afterwards. You don't have to rush off, do you?
Not immediately, no.
No, so if you have questions that you sort of don't want to ask in front of other people, you can come up and ask Stephanie at the end as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming today. I hope I can help with some information for you on looking after your family photographs. I have quite a few, as Sandra said, quite a few things to run through, and quite a few images to show you, as well as some samples on the table that you can look at afterwards. So photographs have come a long way since 1824. As everyday items, we don't always care for them well. Many are delicate and vulnerable to damage from handling, storage and display. They can also be vulnerable from the inherent chemical instability. Today I'll talk about taking good physical care of your photos to ensure they last as long as possible to be passed down to future generations. I will focus on pre-digital photographs. I'm a paper conservator with a primary expertise in paper, photographic and book collection items. Conservators aim to safeguard cultural material for the future. We do this by using the least possible intervention, using tested materials and techniques to treat, house and handle items. We consider the integrity of an item by understanding its materials, history and deterioration processes. We also document any changes that we make. Family photos come in an amazing range of types and formats, from cased images, albumin photos, cabinet cards, large framed prints, glass or film negatives, colour prints, albums and many more. And I've set up a small display in the Colonial Gallery, the room just off the back there, of a range of different processes. Some of you may be familiar with all of them, some of you may not be familiar with the very early processes, you may just be familiar with the more recent ones, but there's a across the board range of those kinds of examples in there. Identifying what you have can be difficult sometimes. There are a lot of reference books and websites available to help you with this, and I placed a handout on your chairs with those web resources and a couple of examples of the reference books I have in my library in Conservation are up here for you to just have a look at. Timelines can help with identifying the process, and knowing the process can often help with dating a photograph, which is probably one of the most important things that you'd be interested in. It can also guide your care and your choice of storage systems for the photographic collection, as not all photographs benefit from the same kind of storage environment. Ask yourself the following questions. Are you organising your photos to preserve them, to make them accessible as part of your genealogy work, to share or bequeath to your family, or are you donating to a local museum or an archive? This might influence how you organise them and how you store them. You should decide what to keep and at the same time make lists including the processes, so negatives, prints, and all the other different processes, quantities, sizes. If you work out your priorities for your budget, you can then purchase storage materials in one go and organise them more efficiently. There is a reference on your handout about family history. I think it's towards the bottom. Family history and how to approach it. So that I found that was quite a useful one. Poor environments, careless handling, poor storage containers and prolonged display can also cause damage. There's also inherent chemical problems with some types of photographic material. Find a storage solution that is stable all year round. Internal cupboards against internal walls are good. Avoid garages, basements, attics. You probably know why. They usually suffer from dramatic fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity, let alone the danger of water damage. And this causes significant stress on the structures within the photograph. Dust and dirt attracts moisture and insects. Avoid the floor. There's always the potential for water damage from a range of sources. Avoid gaseous pollutants, so avoid new paint, new woods, cleaning supplies. They cause oxidation, which results in staining, fading or silvering of the image. The rate of chemical and physical deterioration will be increased by high temperatures. Quite lucky at the moment, aren't we? They can cause embrittlement, discoloration and cracking of emulsions, and some film supports might break down. Temperature should be stable and even wherever possible. Currently the guidelines for Australia, and we've got guidelines that go for different climatic regions as well, are for between 15 and 25 degrees Celsius, with allowable fluctuations of only plus or minus 4 degrees per 24 hours. So you can see it's the rapid fluctuations. Rapid and wide fluctuations are the worst things, worst environment. The Conservation Association is called the Australian Institute for the Conservation of Cultural Materials, AICCM for short. It published environmental guidelines for all the different regions in Australia. So you can have a look at, I think I've got their website on your list. You can have a look at the website, type in environmental guidelines and it will come up. It's important to avoid windows and proximity to heaters. This photograph on the right was found behind a mirror on a mantelpiece over a fireplace after about 30 years. Probably a lovely discovery at the time, but then they were very saddened by its condition, and that's what heat has done to it. High relative humidity can cause the gelatin on photographs to stick together or to adhere to their storage sleeves, and mould can grow on emulsions and supports. So the current guidelines for relative humidity are between 45 and 55%, with an allowable fluctuation of plus or minus 5% in 24 hours. It is actually quite hard to achieve that in your average house, which is why we recommend you find the most stable internal wall room that you can. And where the storage and display environments experience seasonal shift, so you may have high relative humidity in summer and lower in winter, then as long as the range that it's within is not too extreme, it can drift from higher to lower in summer. If you looked at the whole year, you might say, oh, we've got from 35% right up to 70%. That's not good. But if it's still in a narrow band but changes, the material can adjust. Light exposure can cause damage, particularly the ultraviolet light component. It causes yellowing, fading, discoloration, cracks in emulsions. Early photographic processes, early colour film and colour prints, cyanotypes and early resin-coated prints are particularly vulnerable to light damage. Early colour dyes were not very light fast and can look quite monochrome over time, like these examples on the right. This is our Allport gallery. So avoid displaying photographs permanently. The damage is cumulative and irreversible. So if you've had something on your wall, you're not going to be able to put it away for 10 years and it'll be brighter again. You've lost whatever has already faded. So turn off the lights, draw the curtains, use UV filtering in frames, and rotate items on display, especially if you've got a large collection. My recommendation would always be to display good quality copies. The image-bearing layer of a photograph is usually very fragile. On the left is a microscopic cross-section of an albumin photograph showing the thin emulsion layer directly embedded in the paper. And on the right is a cross-section of a colour photograph showing how thin the image layer is. This image layer varies with the type of photograph, but it's usually very thin, very vulnerable and easily damaged. Chemical deterioration causes problems such as mirroring on silver gelatin emulsions, where the silver ions are oxidised. It's believed to be connected with the acidic atmospheric pollutants like sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, oxides of nitrogen, peroxides and ozones, as well as high humidity and acidic compounds in storage materials. Albumin images and other processes can fade in light or in contact with poor quality materials. Photographic film supports such as nitrate and cellulose acetate films may self-destruct because of their chemical instability. The example on the top right is a nitrate negative that was sandwiched between glass. The deterioration process is likely to have been sped up by being enclosed in that environment. So we had to digitise it very quickly to save a record of the image. He was a sea captain. Can't remember his name. Storage and handling can influence how well and in what condition the photographic materials last. Always have a clear and clean space to work. Perhaps cover the area with some clean paper which can be changed. Don't hurry and don't eat or drink while you're working with your photographs. Handle the photographs as little as possible. Hold photos with two hands by the edges and use a support like a piece of card if it is very fragile or brittle. Avoid touching the image surface. As you saw, it's a very fragile, delicate, thin layer. Clean hands should be free of lotions and creams and hand sanitizer. And wear plastic powder-free gloves and discard them when they're soiled. The recommendation now is not to use white cotton gloves at all, but to use plastic gloves, preferably, they say, are powder-free and non-latex because some people have allergies to latex, and so the nitrile are very inert and they don't have plasticizers as well that can affect materials. There's a pair for you to have a feel of there.
Could you amplify the white glove?
I could. I've actually got some articles about it too, but the main issue is that white gloves are quite loose, and if you've got a delicate paper item, you can't pick it up easily. When you've got a glove on like that, you've got much better manual dexterity. The other factor is if you wear your white gloves for several hours, the sweat from your hands goes straight through the cotton and onto the photographs, and they get very dirty, and you can transfer that dirt from one item to another as well. They're really the three main reasons. So we now in the library archive world, we recommend cleanly washed hands for most paper items, but I recommend plastic gloves for photographic items. We also recommend plastic gloves for gilt and bone and ceramic objects as well. But there have been a lot of conservation studies into, does somebody have more acidic hands than someone else, and how does the recently eaten lunch affect the object compared to someone who's washed their hands? Amazing trials that you would think, they spent how long doing this? Anyway, it does help us to then provide good recommendations to people. So remove photos from the envelopes that they're in, rather than by opening the envelope as much as possible, rather than sliding the item out against the envelope, because the surface can be scratched if you're sliding it against another piece of paper, envelope, or whatever it might be. I've often, if I'm being concerned about something that's in a tight container, I'll even cut around the edge to peel it open, to lift the photograph out rather than slide it out. And if it's stuck, don't attempt to remove it. Come and talk to a conservator. Supports or card mounts are easily damaged, and the image surface can be scratched, as I've just mentioned. You can see a good example there on the left. Paper and card can be creased, torn and broken, so you must always handle these with extreme care, especially the kind of era that you're looking at on the right there. Those card supports are very brittle. And glass supports, glass plate negatives, can be dropped and broken. Mould can consume prints, attacking the paper and the gelatin. There are two more examples of what can happen to the supports of the image. Use cushions to support photo albums, or some very good firm supporting wedge to hold the boards up, rather than opening the item at 180 degrees flat. You probably, when you do that, you'll hear this crack, and that's the last thing you want to hear, because if it's a sewn binding in an album, you've probably just fractured the binding sewing, and it's a very expensive thing to fix if you were to get a conservator to fix that. And don't stack loose prints or glass plate negatives on top of each other without anything interleaving between them. It's so easy to scratch them, and certainly don't slide anything across the surface. I'm very good on the don't do this, don't do that thing, as Sandra and Clifford have vouched for. Use extreme care to check if a curled photo can be unrolled safely. If it seems really tight and it's very resistant, it's quite likely that as you try and unroll it, it's going to crack. And there are ways that a conservator can relax the item and get it to open without cracking. Sometimes you can go carefully and slowly and think, oh yes, that is okay. And we have, actually I didn't bring any, some little leather covered lead shot weights that you can buy from the suppliers to use to anchor the corners down and then slowly work through to open them up. Damaging attachments include metal paper clips which can rust, pressure sensitive tapes or sticky tape, we call them pressure sensitive tape, and labels can also cause yellowing or stickiness. Rubber adhesives and stain and embrittle. Acrylic adhesives ooze, and that includes contemporary sticky tapes. The carrier actually shrinks and the adhesive is left around the edge, and that can then stick to other items adjacent to it. Rubber bands and rubber cement also rot and discolour. Glues and laminations can cross-link and stain. Use enclosures to group things together, like folders, envelopes, and then keep them all together in another folder. A lot of our time is spent removing pressure-sensitive tape from paper items, and it can be a very challenging job at times. Sometimes it's about an hour for a centimetre if it's not going well. Chemical staining due to poor processing can also show up as light spots and discoloration, which become more obvious over time. Not much can be done to fix poor processing. Once the chemicals are left in the photograph and are embedded there, they can't be washed out. It's best to copy them and store the originals separately. It's preferable to label the enclosure rather than the photograph. If it must be labelled, use only soft pencil on the back edges without pressing too hard. This will avoid denting the photograph from the back, seen in the central image here. Permanent markers can be used on plastic sleeves or on custom labelling tabs. Proper housing gives protective layers to prevent damage caused by handling, changes in the environment or dust and light. Store different types of photographs separately where possible, especially prints from negatives. Housing needs to be made from very good quality materials if your photos are to last as long as possible. There are international paper standards in the industry for permanent paper. There's also a photographic activity test, or the PAT, for enclosures, which indicates if they're safe for photographic material. The National Archives of Australia actually have a testing facility, and conservators and even suppliers and producers often send their products there to be tested, and so that when they sell them they can put passes the PAT, or the PAT, and you can be fairly confident that that's going to be a good quality material that you can purchase. Suppliers can always find ways around that too. So poor quality materials or papers and boards, such as ordinary cardboard, often becomes acidic over time, and that acid can migrate into the photographs. Many poor quality materials include acidic papers, black papers, rubber cement and rubber bands, which contain sulphur, and it's sulphur that tarnishes the silver in which the image-bearing layer is embedded into the photograph. Avoid plastic tubs if you can, and I know we probably all have plastic tubs with things in them, but they can seal in the moisture and they can give off chemical contaminants. If you do use them, I would always recommend some sort of ventilation and good wrapping or packaging with archival boards or papers, which can absorb some of that chemical off-gassing that the tub will do. But if you can, go for archival boxes, and I've got some examples over here. That would be a much better way to go. Plastic enclosures, we've also probably all got a whole different range of types of plastic that we've got photographs in. They do help protect items, particularly when you want to view them regularly or frequently, or when you're sorting them out. They really help to avoid touching the surface while you're working with them. The most widely accepted plastic enclosure in the conservation community is called mylar, or Melanex, which is an inert polyester. Polypropylene, polyethylene are also acceptable, providing it's free from plasticizers and the surface isn't glazed or coated with something. PVC shouldn't be used, and you can identify PVC because it may be labelled as vinyl or have an odour or an oiliness to it. The top right is, I think, yes, PVC sleeve. So they don't look that bad when you look at them like that, but I've found slides or colour transparencies in our collection over time that have developed these little oily droplets on the image, on the actual emulsion side of the image, and that's a reaction with the phthalates in the plastic and the chlorine in the PVC. And it's very, very difficult to actually safely remove those oily droplets. So as soon as we get slides coming into the collection that exist in PVC sleeves, we transfer them into archival sleeves, usually polypropylene. There's also some examples on the table of mylar and polypropylene sleeves as well. And an all box album over there, it also has polypropylene sleeves in it. Albums are often made of low quality materials. And if you decide that you're going to migrate them from a low quality album to a good quality album, it's important to really think carefully about that, because you need to think about the integrity of the album arrangement. Photographs tell quite a story when they're arranged on pages with inscriptions and dates, and there's a flow to the whole story, even if it's a chronological one of over 5 years of somebody's life in the 1920s. It's something I wouldn't recommend, despite the fact that the paper might be very acidic. You can do things like interleaving with a tissue, a silver safe tissue, and then boxing it in an archival box, and that will go some way towards slowing down that deterioration process. I think keeping the integrity of the album is much more important. I may say something different though if it was one of those magnetic albums from the 70s or 80s, because they can be quite damaging to the photographs, especially black and white photographs. However, even with those, if it's one of those, if it's an old magnetic album that was put together very lovingly, almost like a scrapbooker would today, with decorative inscriptions and all sorts of things, I would still not take anything out of that, unless it was obviously damaging the photograph. Say you had a black and white photograph in there and you could see the lines of yellowing adhesive coming through the image. You can think on the one hand, maybe it's done all the damage it's ever going to do, or you might decide that it is really still affecting them too badly and you need to get them out and into a safer album. It's always a bit of an ethical discussion you have in your head with yourself about those things. So if you can avoid the magnetic albums in the first place, then you're halfway there. You can remove the photos with fine spatulas, and somebody even recommended dental floss, though I haven't personally had a lot of success with dental floss. It would be worth a try if sometimes the photographs will come out of the magnetic albums with dental floss. There are quite a few newer albums of archival quality around, like the all box style, and there was an album called a Henzo, or Henzo was the brand, I think, album, which I haven't seen around locally for quite a while, so you'd have to probably do a bit of online shopping for that one, try and source it. And they have permanent paper pages with interleaving, and you can mount your photographs in there with photo corners, the old style photo corners, because they don't attach directly to the item, and as long as they don't cut into it or they're not really acidic, then they could be plastic or paper corners, and that's a nice reversible method of attaching them. So larger collections of photographs can be stored in boxes. They can be placed in their plastic or paper sleeves and within folders for organisation. Boxes shouldn't be packed too tightly, as this makes handling difficult, and if they're too loose they'll also slump and slide around. Vertical storage is good for standard size photographs, glass plate negatives, lantern slides. Large photographs should be stored flat, but avoid stacking too many on top of each other, because too much weight would then be on the bottom ones. matting and framing photographs has often resulted in damage caused by poor quality materials. Probably all seen the back of a frame like that somewhere in our travels. Extreme care is needed if you are deciding to remove photos from the frames. If an item's stuck to the glazing, you really need to contact a conservator to work out whether it is safe to go any further. Always retain any information on the back of the frame, such as inscriptions, framers' labels, which can tell you about the date, the location, the identity of the sitter. We often photograph the entire back, as you can see here, and if there is something that's particularly pertinent to the item, we then keep a good quality colour copy of that with the item even when we reframe it. And it's important to use good quality attachments to the photograph if you are framing your photograph for display. I always err on the side of something that's not going to attach directly to the photograph, because you can also use corners within a window mount when you're framing something as well if you want to. But if you're taking it to a commercial framer, you'd need to check what they're using and whether it's of an archival quality or not, and what sort of technique they use to attach it to your photograph. Because it's ideal if it's not something that's not going to actually affect it adversely in the long run. And also, where possible, use UV filtering acrylic to glaze it, which will help to keep the light down and keep the light levels low wherever you do have it on display. The light levels can be measured by a lux meter, and in the old days only professional photographers had lux meters, or amateur photographers had lux meters, but these days you can pop down to JCar or order one online. There's even an app you can buy an attachment for your smartphone and download an app and have a lux meter built into your phone. I thought that was quite snazzy. When storing framed photos, if you have a number of them, remove the fittings from the back because they can damage the adjacent items. But again, my recommendation always is to display copies, good quality copies. So copying and scanning, which is not my area, we have an entire digitisation services section here for that. But it does reduce the handling of the originals and it improves access, even for families. As I'm sure you all know, you're busy scanning the family slides and then sending them via cloud or a link to a cloud storage system to your relatives so that you can all share them. It's quite good. But damage can be enhanced digitally rather than the original, and copies can be used for display. Extreme care is needed during copying and with handling, especially with albums or damaged items. I think overhead cameras are much safer than flatbed scanners overall, but it does depend a bit on the type of item that you're copying or scanning. If it's a whole series of fairly flat, regular size things, then a flatbed scanner would probably be fine. But anything particularly unique and albums in particular are quite difficult to use a scanner for. And migrate the images with changes of technology. Always keep the originals. Don't ever think, oh, I've scanned all the family photos, I don't need to keep the originals. I can clear out that cupboard. But as we know, technology changes all the time, and the files you had 15 years ago that are 500 meg now should be 15 gigabyte. You know, that's probably an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. It's the technology is always changing, so you need to make sure that you're migrating, backing up, keeping a copy offsite, master copy somewhere offsite as well. If you're really the custodian of the family photos, that's the way to go. I'm not really a Luddite, I'm just cautious. And disasters are a real threat to photographic materials, especially as we've seen in the last few years. The layers of housing that you provide, the storage containers, give some protection depending on the scale of the fire. Store originals and copies or negatives in different locations, make backups, kept off-site, shared with other family members. Have a list prepared of your most important photographic collection boxes or albums ready to take with you. In the event of a disaster, don't discard anything, even if you think it's gone and lost or nearly, just about gone. There's often something that's salvageable. You can seek advice from the Conservation Association, the ARCCM. You'll find there's a link on the handout to the ARCCM website, and they've got quite a good section on salvaging your material, your collection, your photographs in the event of a disaster, flood or fire. So when to contact a conservator in the event of a disaster, where you've got deteriorating negatives, active mould growth, flaking emulsion, some stains from pressure-sensitive tape can be dealt with, tightly rolled or curled photos, severe tears, cracks, broken mounts, or photos adhered to the glazing in a frame. I've got a bit of time to just show you a treatment that I did a while back, which was a photograph of Queenstown and panorama of Queenstown in Tasmania. It was taken by Melvin Vannyman, an American photographer working for the Oceanic Steamship Company. And this is a platinum panorama of Queenstown in 1904. It was salvaged from the west coast, having fallen off the wall, breaking the glass and causing big rents in the paper and the linen support underneath. So it was on a stretcher. And there wasn't very much backing either to protect it. So I washed it, I've repaired it, I've lined the photograph and then reframed it in its original frame, which is there. Colours are a bit different because I took them at different times, different cameras. So, but what I was thinking, it's quite a large panorama too. It is 376 millimetres high and 1,190 millimetres long, which in the old scale is nearly 15 inches by nearly 47 inches. It's quite large. And it was contact printed from the negative. So the negative was that size, and that was placed on the paper and it was exposed.
More than one exposure though, because it said they were overlapped.
That was my photographic technology at the time. When I took the before photos, which was some years ago, I couldn't levitate high enough to get a decent photo, so I took it in sections. And also I haven't photoshopped it together. I'd have to give it to Clifford or someone else to do the good Photoshop to art it up so that it looks smooth. So that's what I mean by overlapped. It was one sheet of paper, one negative. It wasn't buttered like in fact in the display in the Colonial Gallery there's a beautiful early panorama of Hobart in I think 5 sections. So no, it wasn't in sections. But I thought I'd like to tell you a little bit about Melvin Vannyman, because when I was working on the photograph, I thought, who is this man? And I started reading about it, and a curator of photographs at the State Library of New South Wales, I think, was doing quite a lot of research, and I found his information. And you can now find it all online. So just a little bit of his life, Melvin's life story. I thought I would tell you a little story, because I think it's just fascinating. He was born in 1866 into an agricultural family in Illinois. He studied music and then he taught it, and then he toured America with the Louisiana Opera Company for 11 years. And during those tours, he became interested in photography, and he would scale the tall buildings in every city they went to. And apparently they toured every state but 2 in America. And so he would go up and take photographs from high spots. So he became quite interested in that. But the company folded during a plague scare in Hawaii. after 11 years, and he called for his childhood sweetheart to join him in Hawaii, and they got married. And then he worked as an electrician for 2 years. So we're talking quite early. But then he started working as a photographer. I think his love of photography took over, and he was able to produce. He started producing panoramas, and started to be able to do it professionally. And he was taking photographs from great heights. And over his photographic career, he'd take them from mountain tops, high buildings, ships' masts. He even built a 30-foot pole and got himself up to the top of it with lugging his large panorama cameras. And then the Oceanic Steamship Navigation Company noticed him and commissioned him to go to New Zealand and come to Australia to take photographs to encourage tourism. And when he did a bit of a practice run in New Zealand, and then he got to Sydney and fell in love with Sydney, and always thought that the only way to really show Sydney properly was from the air. And so he ordered a balloon from America, and he spent about 5 months working out how to tether this balloon so that he could go up with his camera and take good panoramas. And if you go to the State Library of New South Wales website and typed in Melbourne Vanneman, you'll be able to look at all of the photographs that they've got in their collection. And he then built a special camera because the ones he had just wouldn't cut it. And so he built a special rotating one. And when I was doing the photograph, I can't remember, it was incredibly heavy object. But he needed it to be especially engineered so that it counted the swaying of the balloon when he was actually taking the photo. And after Australia, he went to France to try his hand at photography there. But he was so disheartened by the cloudy skies and the poor visibility after the Australian bright light, especially Sydney, that he couldn't actually make a living. So he decided to build triplanes. I must say he's got a bit of an engineering background going right back to his agricultural upbringing. But so while he was building triplanes, he met an American wheeler and dealer newspaper man called Walter Wellman, and they embarked on an unsuccessful attempt to reach the North Pole in a hydrogen-filled dirigible. And then they planned to cross the Atlantic by air as well, and neither of these feats had been achieved at that stage. So the Atlantic crossing was also unsuccessful, and they had to be rescued when their motors failed. And there's also a great story of Kito the cat, who was taken at the last minute onto the dirigible, but the cat didn't like it. And apparently Vanneman made the first in-flight radio message back to shore to ask them to quote, "Come and get this goddamn cat." They tried to get rid of the cat, but they couldn't actually drop him to a boat below successfully, so the cat stayed. But then, and then they had to be rescued after that, so by a boat that came their way. Wellman disappeared off the scene, and then in July 1912, Vanneman made another attempt to cross the Atlantic in a dirigible, but it exploded 15 minutes into the flight, and he and his 3 crew were killed. He was aged 46. So I just think his life, what he fitted into 46 years, was just astonishing. And when you look at the images of what he'd produced in a few short years, it's just incredible. I would have loved to hear him sing as well. So, there certainly, I think the story of Kito the cat is on a website called Purr and Fur, if you want to have a read about him. So that's my talk. You're welcome to ask questions and then come up and have a look at the samples of storage materials here, go into the Colonial Gallery and look at the processes. So, if you're trying to identify processes, there are some examples there. Not everything. It would take a whole gallery to actually have every example of every type of photographic process. But, so any questions? Lady in pink.
Is there a service with the library here regarding
Conservation work? Unfortunately, no. And I'm afraid to say that conservators are very thin on the ground right across Australia. And in these COVID times, it's even harder because we quite often have contract conservators come here to do work for us when we don't have the expertise in a particular field. We can't even do that either. However, there is a private paper conservator in Launceston. Her name is Amy Bartlett. You'd certainly find her on Facebook. I think she's got a public Facebook page, or I could give you my contact details and I can let you know her contact details because I don't have them off the top of my head. There's also book conservator Keith Atkins, who's in Launceston, he's been working on a lot of the Allport photograph albums and scrapbooks, sketchbooks over the last decade or so. We also have an object conservator, Michelle Berry, who does private work, and depending on what you have, sometimes it's useful to get her to do work, probably not so much for the photographic world. Also, on the table here, I've got the details of a woman I know who's worked with me at times, but she has a graphic design business, Penny Carey Wells, and she can make storage boxes of archival quality. So you have a custom-made box to the size of your album, so it's not going to move around. Where you buy an off-the-shelf box, it's not going to fit perfectly. You might take up more room than you want as well.
Thank you.
So, any other questions? Yes.
Well, something about writing on the back of photos.
Yes.
Just to use a soft pencil.
Preferably.
Because I was listening to Ask an Artery, and they said they're like a felt tip, and they reckon it's acid free and that would be safe. Is that?
I'm very cautious about anything like that. Felt tip pens, you don't know, are they? It may be a permanent one, like these kinds that have got Lumicolor or the Sharpies. I just don't trust them in the longer term because it is a permanent thing. I'd much rather err on the side of caution. Use pencil if possible.
Oh, okay.
If you're not able to write on it easily, I'd be more inclined to put it into a container, or an envelope, a sleeve, right on the sleeve.
Yep.
It's always a good option. You're not having to mark it as, this is mine, necessarily.
Another question, you were saying I'd use the photo corners.
Yeah.
Is it okay to use that? You get like some tape that's meant to be acid free and you just sort of hold it and put it on the back and it's like a sticky.
Again, that's permanent. So I would avoid that.
Right.
I know scrapbookers use that kind of thing all the time, and they probably are getting better, but I went on a 5-day training course on the removal of pressure sensitive tape and tape stains. You wouldn't think you could spend all day, every day for 5 days, but we could have had another week actually. And two experts from America came over and taught mid-career conservators for a week, and about 12 of us in an intensive. We had to learn about the history of pressure sensitive tape. We had to be able to identify all of them. We then had to learn about the chemistry of them and the carriers, and then how to actually remove them from a whole range of different paper-based things. And the experts said that they were working with 3M in America, the main company, to devise an archival pressure-sensitive tape, and they worked on it for about 4 or 5 years. And 3M came up with this amazing roll of pressure-sensitive tape, and they put it through all their testing, age testing and everything, and they said, no, it doesn't pass. So I take that as an indication that no pressure sensitive tape or double-sided spot or anything is really going to last the distance. It depends on your purpose. You know, I have been known to use pressure sensitive tape for something that is not critical. And you sometimes have to use a bit of practical application too. I can compromise, but I do err on the side of caution. And I do prefer photocopies if possible. Yeah. Yes.
Where would you recommend getting the archival papers and boxes and things like that from?
Well, I promise I don't have shares in the company. I wish I did actually. We use mostly Archival Survival in Melbourne. There have been a number of other companies around the country for here and there, on and off. But these guys actually do a really good job. They can provide very small quantities if that's all you need, or they can provide them by the packs. And I mean, they're not cheap, but which is why I was saying you need to count what you've got, measure what you've got, work out which things are the most important to start with, prioritise them, get a budget together and decide, you know, what you can afford and deal with the important stuff first.
And if you're putting, we've talked about here photos in archival sleeves and things.
Yeah.
But if you have papers, would you put them through into the same?
Oh, okay. Mixing your records, your family records with photographic material.
Or, no, not necessarily mixing them, but I need to work out how to store those as well.
Yeah. Well, for instance, the All Box album system, or I mean, they're not always All Box. The Archival Survival have their own version as well. All Box is actually have had some changes in management and production, and they sent me a batch of sleeves recently. I wasn't so impressed with, but you can get the same sort of thing from Archival Survival as well. They're good because it's a flexible system. Come and have a look at it. You can get sleeves in all sorts of different arrangements. You can get full sheet size, you can get half sheet size, quarter sheet size, sheets for all the different shape negatives that exist. I would still recommend, of course, keeping negatives in a separate one to prints, preferably in different places. But you can also then have full sheet size for documents in between. So you can organise it with documents, particularly if you're telling a story about a particular family or something, you want to keep all of that family's material together, then you can do that sort of thing. The main thing is to not put them in the same sleeve together, but to, and often it's good to put a sheet of clean paper in with them, because one of the problems with plastic is it sets up a microclimate, and if something's really acidic, it hasn't got much air circulating, the acidity actually builds on itself a bit and it can deteriorate a little bit faster. So if you've got a sheet of clean copy paper, clean printer paper in with it, that can absorb some of that acidity. Yes.
I have a marriage certificate from the 1800s in the original envelope.
Oh, yes.
And it's just sitting there.
Yeah.
But I had thought of framing it then with, that's my grandmother's, then my mother's, and then my own.
Oh, yes.
But whether that's a good idea because they're all different papers.
Yes. Well, again, I would recommend getting a good quality colour reproduction done of each of those. And you could even get them put onto one piece of one sheet. Frame that. Put the originals into good quality storage. Even separating the document from the envelope into two different sleeves or paper, you know, so that you can view one and still have all the information that was on the envelope. The envelope's just important in those situations. So, but again, if you're framing them, I would recommend copying them. You can get very good quality copies done. I know there's a Full Gamut in Harrington Street, are a very good company who know about archival records and how to handle them. Full Gamut. So full, Full, and GAMUT. Any other questions? Yes?
I have an old, it's not the photograph, old map which is waiting to get framed because it is so warm. And is it better to...
A map?
A map.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Is it better, I want to get it framed so that it doesn't get handled anymore, and then to sort of put it away. But I don't want, because it's folded, every time you open it,
Yes.
it damages it.
Yeah.
So I'm getting it framed with archival, acid-free
Right.
stuff and putting it behind a frame, and it's going to be in a dark place.
Okay.
Is that a better idea than just...
I don't mind the idea of framing something and putting it in the dark.
Neither do I. I mean, it would cost a fortune to actually get restored, and also I think it takes away from it.
Quite often, a lot of the work we do is, we call it rehousing. We don't necessarily do this kind of thing very often, where we wash and repair and fix all of those problems. We'll often maybe flatten it gently and then put it in good quality storage housing, put it somewhere where it's going to be safe, and leave it. And you're not interfering with a lot of the original integrity of the item in any way.
So, like the idea of having its folds in it because it was carried around the West Coast.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you'll always see those folds because you're not washing it, flattening it, cleaning all of the stains off it, that sort of thing. I mean, if it was me and I had the space, I would be just housing it in a very sturdy archival folder. Or putting, if it's got nothing on the back, I'd be putting it in a large mylar sleeve with a support board and putting that in a folder. And that way the mylar sleeve protects it when you do view it, and the folder protects it, keeps it rigid. I don't know which would be cheaper because it depends on the size.
That's why I put on the wall, it's not taking up as much space.
Yeah. I wouldn't display it though, but
No, it's going to be in a dark.
Yeah, sounds good.
I'll go with pen,
Yeah, I mean, you could look at the Archival Survival website and look into what sort of materials there are there. But again, unless you're handy with a steel ruler and a cutter knife to make a folder, and it's a bit of a business, and unless you've been doing it for 30 years, or if you had somebody who was good at art and craft, that sort of thing, you can get the materials and then get someone to make it. But that could be a good way to go. I hadn't really thought of that before.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, I think we're done then. Please have a look.